All right, thank you for listening to this podcast. This episode of Literally is sponsored by Lexicon and Line. Case, tell us a little something about Lexicon and Line.
Lexicon and Line, it does three things. They are communications consultants. They teach professional business writing and speaking courses, and they are research and data evaluation experts.
And you can find everything about Lexicon and Line at lexicononline.com. Please give them a visit, and thank you so much for sponsoring this podcast, Lexicon and Line.
This is Case Johnston. This is the Literally Podcast. Today we're podcasting from downtown Ogden at the Monarch. Today we're talking with poet Elizabeth Joy Levinson. She teaches, and writes on the west side of Chicago. She has an MFA in poetry from Pacific University in Oregon and an MAT in biology from Miami University. Her work has appeared in several journals, including Gray Sparrow, Up the Staircase, Apple Valley Review, and Hawk and Whippoorwill, Alluvian, and La Presa, and is forthcoming in Slipstream. Has it already come out in Slipstream?
No.
So this fall, good. Her chapbook, As Wild Animals, is available through Dancing Girl Press. Thanks so much, Elizabeth, for joining us, and she's going to jump in with some pieces from the chapbook.
Okay, thank you. So first I'm going to read this poem, The Beekeepers, which I thought would be appropriate because I understand Utah is the beehive state, and I'm just learning all about that and kind of fascinated by it. So The Beekeepers. What makes them do it? These strange men who love a thing that is dying. Each day they suit up like monks or astronauts, mysterious as either. They count the carcasses, each one so light. Those that are left beat furious wings, a dead march that moves the beekeepers from hive to hive. Each day they must decide to divide the colonies, rebuild, or sell them off. There will always be those who have not yet known the bitter aftertaste that follows the harvest of the comb. This is something I would like to try, in a field of clover, to watch them over, to press the bellows of a tin smoker, to wave it around, making gray clouds to move in and out of, pulling each tray with hope for the quiet hum, for the brush of a furry thorax against my wrist, where my gloves might slide down, leaving my skin exposed. And then I'm going to do one more from the chapbook. Is that okay? And this is about my city. The Starlings of Bridgeport. Above the city that burned and was rebuilt with lights that bounce off the atmosphere and yellow the sky, casting out the stars, the starlings rise. With wings spread, they darken the night again, and feathers lit at the tips spark like dying embers. Every night they create constellations and call out new compositions to each other. No one understands why they have risen from the ashes that cooled years ago and were buried beneath foundations of brick and concrete. Every night, just before the city sleeps, the starlings call out, and a memory might respond.
So we're looking at two poems today from the chapbook, As Wild Animals. First, we started with bees, and then the starlings, right? And this is just from the work that I've read, it seems to be that a lot of your poems kind of balance between that kind of pastoral and kind of the city life, and maybe dealing with living in each, or living in one, or maybe not in both at the same time, and maybe a want of one or the other, or a loss of one of the other. And I'm wondering, going into a chapbook like this, was that, I mean, obviously there's a lot of poems that didn't make it in, right? But was there a thematic goal when you put this collection together, or am I reading something that I'm not getting right?
No. You're actually, what you're saying, which is interesting, more applies to my current collection. And I'm going to be perfectly honest about the assemblage of the chapbook, if that's okay. But I was working on this when we were in school together back in 2010. Forever ago, exactly. Yeah. And at the time, I remember feeling a lot of pressure to produce and to publish, and so I was trying to find pieces that connected, and definitely that tension was one of the themes, but also what I was really thinking about are like trying to find 10 to 15 poems that I just thought were good and that were publishable. And luckily, you know, Christy Bowen from Dancing Girl Press was like, yes. And she took them, and I was very happy about that. But what you're talking about, that loss of the connection to nature, is very much what I'm working on now.
Okay. So those were the poems, the newer ones.
Yeah, newer ones. But the obviously they had a seed in this project, right? So
yeah. I mean, even with the beekeepers, right? I mean, if you look at that, it's kind of this wonder of, and I like the line where you talk about, I mean, they're so invested in things that are dying, you know? I mean, that's something, it's really sad. First off, I mean, it really is. I mean, the way I took it, and at the same time, it feels like that want to be a part of something that is still kind of wild. So, I mean, I don't know if that's the seed there.
Yeah. I'm not sure if you were at or remember when we were at Pacific, Barry Lopez talking about the job of the writer, right? And he said that, you know, the world is broken up into fragments, and it's our job to try to figure out how those fragments fit together. And I think definitely for me, that's where I feel the most fragmented, is that I live in Chicago. I live very much removed from the natural world, and all around me, I feel like people are trying to, I mean, you see it in like the way, what is it, Phobo, right? Like we make things that are printed to look like wood, or we use insects in clothing now, you know, and to me, I think that's all about that disconnect, and that like people are trying to get to those fragments. And that's what I'm trying to do.
Yeah. And I mean, so where are you from originally?
Sorry. I had a transient childhood, so I never know how to answer that question. I was born in just outside of Chicago, but I went to like 15 different schools and lived in like 5 different states growing up. So
we talk about loss, and so where was that? And like if you look back and you're looking at writing these poems, that kind of straddle that the loss of nature, or maybe even just the feeling of nature, because Abby says that a lot of people don't need to even be in nature. Abby says that they just need to know it exists to feel less claustrophobic. You know, he's like, the person in New York doesn't need to go to Moab, because Abby didn't want them to go to Moab. He just said they need to know that it exists so that they feel free, so they feel they're not trapped in the city. Where was that connection that created that loss? That's kind of stemming this new work?
A lot of the new work actually is based on time that we spent in Florida as a family. And I think that definitely because Florida is such a wild place in so many ways.
Big snakes,
yes,
huge snakes.
Right, alligators. Right. And yeah. And I was there at a time in my childhood where I was noticing all of these things so much. So I think that definitely, but also, so when like moving a lot, and this is something I've written about, you notice that the nature changes everywhere you go, you know, whereas like a lot of American writers are sort of defined by their place. That was always changing for me, and always novel, and there was always this sense of discovery happening, and I think that's part of it too.
Oh yeah, I can see that. I mean, I live that. I mean, these mountains are ours. I mean, Brandon can attest to that too, that as Utahns, the lake and the mountains define us as people, you know, and going other places, and it's really interesting that you say that. So it's like you go another place, right, and you think this is really kind of exotic, right, but it's not. It's a street, you know, or you go to Europe and it's a road, but you're like, but there's something in you that feels kind of this kind of sense of exploring the exotic part of life. Does that make sense? And to have to live it in different places, because I'm a Utah, I mean, I've been here for most of my life, and to have to live it again, and to live in the exotic, or to live in the new nature, that makes a lot of sense. It's something that I haven't thought of, and my characters in my writing never think of it either. So so with Chicago, So I mean, that's kind of where there's somewhat of a crux, where it comes as a crux, that you are in the city. Does a lot of your new work, I mean, I've read a few pieces that you sent me, and does a lot of the new, or does some of the new work tackle kind of like green space or the manufacturing of kind of nature?
Yeah. Yeah. So the manuscript I'm working on right now is in two parts, and the working title is Uncomfortable Ecologies. So that's what we're talking about, right? And the first part, so in addition to moving around a lot and having this transient childhood, I would also say my childhood was addiction adjacent.
Sure.
I mean, everybody has these stories in their family, and won't get into them. But but I think so. The first part of the manuscript is focused on those kinds of difficult relationships and how those shape the space that you're in. And then the second part is a lot of what you're talking about. So, or what you were just asking me about. So actually like dealing with spaces where there is a tension between green space and urban space, or the people in the space, things like gentrification,
Sure.
how that impacts a community or an ecology.
So with this new project, how far along are you? What are we looking at?
I've started sending it out.
Have you? Oh, good. So this is the time to cross fingers. This is the cross fingers time. Well, good. Oh my gosh, this is always hard. And for those of you who listen and who aren't writers and have never been on submission, give a big finger crossing to Elizabeth right now, because this is the hardest part of writing. I mean, it is. I mean, it just is. And you never know who's reading your stuff, and you don't know what the outcome's going to be. So we do. Yeah, let's hope. So are you going after a full book or a chapbook this?
So it's, I mean, what I'm discussing right now is a full-length manuscript, but there are parts of it that I've pulled out and also submitted in chapbook form recently. So
yeah, it's just like an essay collection. You'll pull out a few essays and say this might work on its own. So can we hear some more?
Yeah. So I'll read the piece that I have coming out in Slipstream, because I think that addresses some of the issues I mentioned with the first part of the manuscript, childhood, and here it is, tensions within the family, but also brings up some sort of environmental things in Florida, all of that. So this is called Exterminator. In Florida, you tried everything, but you couldn't kill the insects faster than they could hatch, so you taught me about them instead. I learned to identify orb weavers, mole crickets. I kept a close watch when they came out just before dawn to drink from condensation on blades of tangled crabgrass. Those mornings, I wove my toes into the stubborn plant's runners. Grainy soil stuck to my skin as the sun heated up, the smell of rotting oranges, so high in the gnarled tree, we could never pick them all. You moved on, sold solar panels, adjustable beds, insurance. Roaches multiplied. We could not keep up. In the evenings, we rinsed in the ocean. We were never clean, we were never refreshed, but we were tired. We slumbered dreamlessly. Eventually, all that wasn't living sank into brown shag behind white stucco walls built on crawfish, cockroaches. They scurried between our feet, watching as we fled, left our things. Plastic Legos, silverware, socks. Hidden from us much later, we realized they were gone. We left those things in the salt-heavy air, the way the moisture collected on skin with sweat and hot dog grease. It was better that way to leave. The ocean always burned, my thighs chafed inside, and eyes red as the ink on the eviction slip and the tongues of the lizards flicking as they ran across the door.
Thank you. And so this talks about a fast departure, right? I mean, this was not something that you had all prepared for. I mean, in some of these questions, of course, with poetry, they're supposed to remain, hidden. But who is the you? the second person within this?
Yeah. So with the what's the word I'm looking for? The notion, of course, that in poetry the I is the narrator and
Sure.
not the I, right?
Mm-hmm.
But the you would be my father.
Okay, yeah. So and this is kind of one of those. I mean, this poem I like this one because of that kind of juxtaposition of that, like playing in the ocean and having fun and toys, and then all of a sudden departure, eviction slip, right? And it's not an easy one to swallow. That's a game changer in the sense that thematically for a book, this goes away from anything that might be considered just kind of, or a theme that might be the natural world or ekphrastic or whatever. But this is a story. Does the collection that's being sent out now follow a narrative line when it comes with your poetry, or is it more of pieces from other parts of this kind of
the first part is a
This
narrative.
is-
Yeah.
yeah, and so you've split it in two. Is that what you've done?
Yeah.
What's the second part? What are we looking? What is going to be published? I'm putting it out there. I have to. You know, it's like as writers, we have to.
It's good juju.
You have to
I
put it
need
out.
all the juju
We
I can
all
get.
need the juju, and it's like, and as writers, some people just like they think that there's no space. There's plenty of space. The good writers should always be published. So if that narrative is the first part of the new collection, what's the second?
So the second part is about that tension we were talking about before.
Mm-hmm.
So I think, so moving around a lot and always sort of being like the new kid and also being just a highly introverted person
Sure.
who really only understood what that meant recently. There's a lot of like, I talk a lot about like feeling isolated from things and that could be that like fragmented from nature or fragmented from others in some way.
Yeah.
And so the other pieces are along those lines.
Great. Do you have another?
Yeah. Why don't
If not,
we...
we're gonna make you. I'll just flip through.
No. I picked out a couple.
Good.
It was so here I'm go ahead and read the title poem, which is
Okay.
actually this is from the first part. This is towards the end of the first part. And the title of the poem is actually Transfusion. Down the street, the house, literally under the tracks. How dark it must be. All the windows boarded over. When the front door opens and I can see in. How hard to imagine that this was once a home. How cavernous it seems. And the men, like miners, move expertly through the building. They know where to cut and rip, following the veins that used to flow to the television, the AC, the light over a dining room table. Who once sat there? Who once ate food in this room? They pull whole handfuls through the drywall and mud, lengths and lengths of corded energy. It is an uncomfortable ecology. When they come back out, two women wait with buckets and knives. They slit the rubber sheathing, shucking copper from the sleeves, hoping this thin conduit will become something viable again. And I want to read another piece from this section. And this is actually, this is the last one from the first part. And this was published recently in Landlocked, which is a great journal. Really happy they included it in their last issue. And this one is called Insufficient Funds. I am sorry I have existed, taken up space, opened my mouth and spoken, or opened my mouth and did not speak. I stepped on a butterfly. I stepped on a crack. I stepped on concrete. Someone put concrete down for me to step on. I bought a dress. I did not buy a dress. I did not make myself beautiful with painted lips and laughter. I was unkind. I was a different kind. I was a stereotype. I was the kind of girl who could not hold her horses. I begged for the horses. I left the horses in the pasture. I left the horses out in the rain. The horses were on an island and the shoreline was eroding. I abandoned the land. I did not have enough boards. I did not bring enough nails. I left as my toes were getting wet. I was a good daughter. I sent a check.
This is what I love about poetry, and I'm not a poet. and I've said this a million times. I love to always say it, and I think it's the truth that only smart people are poets. I just don't. I've tried, but I love poetry because of a poem like this. Like, this is a poem in a new journal with a lot of different authors, a lot of different poets, and it stands on its own. It's how many words? It's probably 100 words, maybe. And what poets can do within such a small space, especially with the last line, "I was a good daughter, I sent a check," where everything else is leading to this thing of like this kind of insufficiency, not really in funds, but in kind of feeling less than when it comes to being, to being a family member, to being a daughter. I mean, and I read this morning, and I thought about it, and then it stuck with me because of, funds within the title, but then the check is the last word where it's actually money, but everything else in the middle has nothing to do with money, right? It has to do with relationships between children and their parents, and everything they could not be and thought their parents wanted them to be, and they weren't, and their parents may not have wanted that in the first place. I don't know, and it's like, this is what I love about poetry. So from a craft perspective, right, when it comes to a poem like this, that's going to be published in Elizabeth's new collection as soon as somebody picks it up. I'm putting it out there. Did you have that book ending when you started?
No.
Oh yeah.
No, with this poem?
Right.
No.
Yeah. Like if you were to pick a line, where did this one start? Like what was the Nader? Not Ralph Nader.
Yeah. So this poem is funny because I teach high school writing, right? And one of the things that there's an organization, sorry, I'm going to back up a minute. There's an organization in Chicago that I shout out to, Young Chicago Authors. They host Louder Than a Bomb, which is a big youth poetry slam festival. Mm-hmm. And as part of my job as being a high school teacher, I also coach that. What's been really cool for me is that in the last year and a half or so, I've gotten involved with their community for educators. Mm-hmm. And they do workshops once a month for teachers. And what's amazing is that you do the workshop as a writer, but then you talk about it as a teacher, and so that you can bring it back to your students. And this was a workshop that I got from one of their workshops. And when I did the workshop, I didn't get this poem. I don't remember what I wrote. It was horrible. Mm-hmm. But I did the workshop with my students, and I always write with my students. If they're going to write, I'm going to write. Yeah. And this just kind of came out of, doing a workshop with students at like 6 p.m. when I'd been teaching since 8 a.m. and was exhausted. And this actually really helped me figure out what the manuscript wanted to be.
Like the first part and the second part probably. Yeah, like this whole idea of mixing family and then movement and then finding a new place and all of it together. Yeah. I love that poem. I love that this poem kind of sets you up multiple times and then pulls the rug out. I stepped on a crack. Wait, I stepped on a butterfly. I stepped on a crack. I stepped on concrete. Someone put concrete down for me to step on. It's like it's a couple lines that like I got set up here. I got set up and there was nothing I could do to get around failure because somebody set me up to fail. I stepped on a crack on concrete because somebody put the crack in the concrete there. And that's why I love that poem for that reason. And then the book ending of it too, with funds and check and nothing in the middle has anything to do with money. Yeah, so it's a good poem. Not good. That's the thing with poetry. I have to teach my first poetry class this fall.
Oh, that's exciting.
I don't know what I'm going to do. It's an intro class, And
I have so many things
you
for you.
need to send me stuff,
will.
like, because I am such a poet. Like,
Wait, is this a college class?
It's at Weber.
Okay.
And yeah, so it's the intro to creative writing. So one section is going to be poetry, and I'm pretty good at looking at a poem and saying, okay, I think this thematically this is cool, and look what the poet did. Like, I look at some of the poets that we know, and I'm like, holy crap, that's amazing. And looking at your poem here, I'm like, what a move, But to teach it, I don't know what I'm gonna do besides just say, look how cool that was, right? So yeah, you have to send me stuff.
Yeah. I think it's because you're doing it as a writing class. Like,
right.
I would hate it if somebody wanted me to teach like a literature class on poetry because of having, but like when you can just, what you're saying, like just show people poems and be like, look at what this poet did.
Right.
Let's try to do something
like
cool too. Like,
that's what's hard, because I've never been able to personally do it. And I admit that, like, straight out. I mean, I could read your poem and I could say, look what she did. That's really cool from a craft point of view, but I could not replicate it in poetry. Like, I could do it in an essay, but it would take me 7,000 words to
I can't do that
to pull that rug out. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
And so yes, if you have anything for me, send even with just
not my stuff. I mean, just I have lots of good resources
like pedagogy.
to share.
Like how to teach it. Okay, cool.
Yeah.
And anybody else wants it, Elizabeth's just going to give it out. No, I'm just kidding.
We got to take your class. Is what we got to do.
No.
Huh?
We got to take your class.
Hers?
Yours.
Well, I think the fiction and nonfiction I got handled, but I'm not sure about the poetry. Anyway, because I have to teach 3 genres. It's either poetry or playwriting. And I'm like, I think I'd rather read poetry. So
yeah.
So okay. You got more?
Yeah.
Cool.
I can. Yeah.
Let's do another.
Okay. So this is another one that came out earlier this year. That's also in the collection. That I can do that one too.
No, you choose.
Okay. So this is a short one, and then I'll do that one.
Cool.
So this is the Parakeets in Douglas Park, Chicago.
Yeah.
And this one is really old. I wrote it. So Tia Brown, that we went to school with, of course, she stayed with me for a while, and we were out at this park by my house. Douglas Park, and it's where me and my husband walk our dog every day. It's also where there's a lot of violence because it's a huge park, but a lot of different neighborhoods kind of intersect within this green space. And we have a community of monk parakeets in Chicago, which don't belong there. They were smuggled into the country and got loose out of a suitcase, and they've been here since the 70s, and so every once in a while you get to see them. Parakeets in Douglas Park, Chicago. The monk parakeets cross over the trees like pairs to wing, like the green dreams of the leaves that were all crushed when they fell to the ground under the feet of so many who passed through. It is strange the parrots would stay as the wind stays, as the wind picks up strength. This was never a home for them. But where else would they go? Removed from their homes and then released. It is no freedom to be so far from home. Yet they weave sticks so strongly together. They bend the power lines, pull down the poles. People lose electricity, fires start, and nobody knows for sure what the right thing is. This came out this year in journal Alluvian. And Alluvian is a journal that tries to tackle the intersection between the built environment and the natural environment.
Right.
And so it's really cool for me because I'm seeing a lot more journals and projects that are sort of rising up around eco-poetry, which
Right.
is clearly something I'm interested in.
Mm-hmm.
So this is the wild horses on Cumberland Island. In the morning, they greeted us, grazing in the shade of the field house at the dock. They were not the pasture-fed thoroughbreds of the Midwest. Their hides were pocked with scars, whorls of hair around sores or ticks. Thin manes twitched as flies circled the air around their ears. They were indifferent, a stallion, 2 mares. Only the yearling paid any notice as I left the boat and approached. She tossed her head, nostrils flaring. She pranced around the elders nervously, and when they failed to react, she came near to me. We were 5 feet apart, and her sleek, chestnut coat was still, unmarred by the elements. She stepped closer. 1, 2. I was afraid to stay. I was afraid to move. I was so worried about what would come next, and I can't remember, if her forelock was white, if the hair hung in her eyes, or if she quietly whinnied as the stallion finally regarded me with a snort of disgust that called her back.
First off, to have someone translate your work, that's pretty cool, right?
That was awesome.
Yeah, I mean that's just cool. I mean, what a great concept with a journal to publish the English version than the Spanish version that way, and how beautiful the Spanish is too.
Yeah.
You know, I mean, it's like I read that one and then I read it in Spanish, and the Spanish is gorgeous. You know, and it's could you do that with rhymed meter? You know what I mean? Like, could that translation be the same outside of kind of like this free verse world? Because the Spanish is beautiful, because the content, the meaning's the same, right?
Right.
If you had to rhyme it, it would just go away, wouldn't it?
Well, you would lose that.
Yeah.
So I guess you would hope you had a translator who could give you something else.
Right.
You know, but
Think
you would.
close.
Yeah.
Yeah. But because it's beautiful in Spanish. You know, if my Spanish were better, we should have Lee back on, and Lee could do her Spanish. And I love the part about with this poem about how these little parakeets can cause so much havoc. You know,
Yeah.
and it takes me back to the bees too, in the sense that the bees are so small, but how much havoc can they cause because they're dying? That poem, all the way at the beginning, when we start talking about this, it's like the bees dying is such a sad thing, but people want to be with them. And these parakeets have that same kind of feeling to it. Like, they're beautiful and small, but man, what the havoc they can have if they choose to, you know.
Right.
That's what I love about poetry. You can put one poet in and it's a whole narrative. It's a whole story. It's so much to do.
Well, and I think too that one thing I try to capture, and this is partially with relationships, right, is that there's danger in relationships with anyone or anything. And I didn't mention this with the bee poem, but I'm allergic to bees, so that's the.
Oh yeah, so you said
so,
I would love to do what they do.
Right. So and with the parakeets, I mean, they really were they were nesting on transformers and starting these huge explosions, and yet it's just a little parakeet, right? So like that, but like that's any like human to human relationship or
Sure.
Sorry, I'm rambling.
No, please. No. Yeah, it's true. Well, I mean, if you follow that, it's like with relationships, I shouldn't divulge this, you know, because we only have 3 minutes left and it's a whole different conversation. But I'm one of those, I'm very empathetic in the sense that I worry so much about anything I say to anybody else. And then anything somebody says to me, I take and I spin and I spin. And I don't think I'm too different from anybody else, but maybe just more, I'm very hyper aware. Maybe that's the word, about people, relationships. So everybody I know has probably gotten some kind of email or text like, did I say something wrong? I apologize. You know, I mean, so, but it's true about relationships in that way, that the littlest thing can start fires, you know, just like the parakeets.
I'm still waiting for my text case.
Well, because I know. I don't worry about you. Is there anything else, like, if you were to just, do you have a question?
Well, I was curious how cathartic the writing is for you in your work.
Writing is cathartic. Editing is not, right? And that's as a teacher, that's a really hard thing to teach my students, right? Because they all have these raw emotions that they want to get out, and I think like there is like catharsis and therapy in writing, but then you have to go back and you have to make it something that someone else needs to hear, not just something you need to write.
Right.
So does the brevity in poetry rid too much of the catharsis?
I think for me, the brevity in poetry is it is the catharsis, because it forces me to isolate a thing and try to figure that out. Like instead of, seeing everything at once and feeling overwhelmed. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Isolate, well, an emotion, the feeling, a day.
Yeah.
And pin it down.
To pin it down. That's it. It's really about like trying to distill something,
Right.
and like you don't know what that thing is going to be, right?
Mm-hmm.
You're going to run it through a filter.
You don't know.
Yeah, so I guess that is what you're saying, and yes.
But the pinning it.
Sorry.
But doesn't the pinning it down? It's almost like it takes away maybe, I don't know, the spinning. Like if you're able to pin it down, the spinning goes away.
Yeah.
A bit, and that's cathartic.
Well, and I think too, you see it new,
right?
and you don't see this. Yeah, this movie that you say spinning, I show the movie over and over
Sure.
again, right?
Mm-hmm.
But like now it's something new and not your lived experience, but like its own thing.
Right. Yeah. No, I see it. Yeah. Well, that's why, and I'll say this honestly, why, downtown here a while back we started Poet Flow, and which was great, but people just wanted, I stopped going, and sorry for those who are listening, but I stopped going because I got a little frustrated because it was all the raw emotion and without the next week, the revision, and
Right.
I always like the revision because the revisions or the fifth revision is always better. And there's nothing wrong with that raw emotion, especially in poetry. But the best poets are able to pin it down. They're able to focus and say, okay, it's not just raw emotion. I'm going to pin down the one, and we're going to put it into a language that can fit in a journal that stands on its own, and that uses language to do it.
Yeah, and it still hits a universal theme.
Right.
Right.
Yeah. It's still, but in a way that we're not always saying it to when we're drunk or something like that, like, and that's not what I meant by povo. I mean, saying that, like, when we have drinks, we're like, oh, she broke my heart. Right. Well, but everybody, that language is very common. But a poet like Elizabeth and other poets that we know are able to pin it down in other languages, in a way that says it differently, but still has the heart of it. So anyways, that was a tangent. This is Case Johnston. This is the Literally Podcast. Today we had Elizabeth Joy Levinson join us. She read her poetry, which I love the format today. I think in the future we need to kind of do it this way.
Poetry, yeah.
Yeah, I love with the poetry where we did a little, we talked, we did a little, we did talk. That worked out really, really well. I like the format and how that turned out. So for the future.
For the future as well, you can't see this on the podcast, but you guys look beautiful in the light over
No,
there.
thank you.
Yeah, the natural light's shining through.
Well, this is our first time in the trailer, and it works. It sounds
Banyan
amazing.
One.
Yeah,
Yeah.
Banyan One. This is
So
great.
cool.
And apologies, we haven't done the podcast for about 3 months. Life's been busy and crazy for me.
Summer break. We'll call it. Yeah.
And that usually happens. But after today, talking with Lee and then talking with Elizabeth, I miss this a lot. This is so much fun for me to get my brain back into talking with writers again. So this is Case Johnston's Literally Podcast. We're podcasting from the Monarch, downtown Ogden on 25th Street. And thanks for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah.
All right, thank you for listening to this podcast. This episode of Literally is sponsored by Lexicon and Line. Case, tell us a little something about Lexicon and Line.
Lexicon and Line, it does 3 things. They are communications consultants. They teach professional business writing and speaking courses, and they are research and data evaluation experts.
And you can find everything about Lexicon and Line at lexicononline.com. Please give them a visit, and thank you so much for sponsoring this podcast, Lexicon and Line.